Chess is split into the opening, the middle game, and the endgame. Most players will focus on openings for white and black, and maybe some puzzle solving to make sure their tactics are sharp, but you should definitely study the endgame too, because endgames are theoretical, which means they're solved. If a position is winning, and you know how to win it, you're going to win 100% of the time, whereas if an endgame is drawn, you'll know how to save it, and you'll know how to get half a point instead of losing rating, and losing points in a tournament, for example. In this video, we're looking at queen versus one pawn endgames. I'll teach you a bunch of different techniques and examples. At the end, I have an example which totally breaks the rules. There's timestamps on the video player as always, if you want to jump around. Let's go. So, the fundamental basis, we will be playing with the white pieces. We'll have the white pieces throughout the video, and black is going to be trying to make a queen, whereas we will have our queen already on the board. Now, this is the introduction. I just kind of want you to understand why this is important. In this example that we have, the easiest way to stop a pawn from getting to the queening square is to get in front of it. And sometimes we can just do that by virtue of geometry. So for example, in this position, we can play the move queen to c2. And now our opponent cannot push their pawn, and if they move their king anywhere, they cannot go anywhere here, so they can't support the pawn push. They go king e5, we go here. And that's it. This is like what we want. This is the absolute easiest thing that we can do ever if the pawn is not that close to becoming a queen. The way we win this is that we now bring the king, we win the pawn, and you have to know how to checkmate with a queen. That's the one prerequisite of this video. If you don't know that yet, that's okay, learn it after. Or maybe I'll have a video. I don't have a video at the time of recording, but that's what we're trying to do here, right? But obviously it's not always so simple, okay? So we're gonna kind of make it a little bit harder now. The king is supporting the pawn, and the pawn is one square away from promotion. So the first nugget of information for you to kind of pay attention to here is which kind of a pawn it is. What does that mean? Well, if it's one of the two central pawns, or it's on B or G, which means like where the knight begins the game, right? The knight usually stands on one of these two squares. If it's a knight's pawn or a center pawn, it is winning for the side with the queen, okay? There is a technique here to win it. If it is a bishop's pawn or a flank pawn or a rook pawn, then more often than not, almost always, it is a draw. If the other side has a close king and the pawn is close. But there's one other thing at play here. It's where our king is. You'll notice that in the beginning, as we learn this, the king is way far away, so there's no way for the queen to do anything. Sorry, the queen has to do everything, I should say. But later, the king is going to get closer, and I'll show you that sometimes there are exceptions to the rule. So let's begin here, okay? In this position, white will need to use a series of checks to force the king in front of the pawn, okay? When that happens, we will get one square closer with the king, and then we will rinse and repeat. For example, check, okay? Check. King can go to a lot of squares, but in general, it should support the pawn promotion, because if it doesn't, there's this, right? As we saw in example 1, so we don't even need to give a check. But if the king is giving defense, do not give a check where the pawn can queen. That is the thing that beginners miss a lot. Get closer with the queen. Now, again, the king wants to avoid this square, so it goes out here. We want to get closer, so we go queen c5, for example. All right? King d1, queen d4 check. We don't want to go here. King c1. And this is our $1 million square, the square right in front of the pawn, which will force the king to come back to defend it. And now we go here. It's this little side step. Now we hit both. Remember, the pawn is coming down this way, and now the king has to go in front, and we bring our king. If the king goes to f1, it's not actually threatening to push. That's what you have to constantly ask yourself. Are they threatening to push? No, because of the pin. Okay, great. And I go, oh, damn, all right, now I'm threatening to push. Again, there's a series of checks, right? Or check, so we would go check. The king comes here, we would go check. King doesn't want to go here, the king comes out here. Magic square. King here, check. King here, rinse and repeat. Now what this looks like as we get closer and closer to the finish line is we go check, you know, king c2, for example. Oh, now it's the $1 million square. Okay? Process repeats. Now when our king is really close, we don't even need to do the process. We can just give a check because the king is defending. If the king goes in front of the pawn, we have this, check, here, checkmate. So that is how you do it with a central pawn. there are other examples of this, like for example, if in the very, very kind of initial position, I just slide over, I just edit the position so it's a knight's pawn and it's like this, the process is all the same. You know, you give a check, for example. And after you give this check, you give maybe this check or this check. Check, check, check. And it looks cramped, but as long as the king is getting away, the same process. Now you can practice this, okay? I mean, that is the technique. You give little checks, zigzag, and you're trying to land on one of those two squares. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer because you give the wrong check, but that is the technique. Why then is it a draw with a rook pawn? Like, why can't we just do the same process? Well, let's try, okay? Let's give a check, or this check, okay? The problem here is that the black king can actually get in front of the pawn. That's the issue. We don't have a moment to bring our king because of the threat of stalemate, right? The rule that if we're not checking the enemy king, but it also but the enemy doesn't have any legal moves, then it's a draw, right? That's what a stalemate is. So the constant threat of a stalemate makes us move our queen, and it doesn't matter how close we get. We can give as many checks as we want. So long as the king stays close, there's nothing we can do. Now, if the king goes to b3, oh, boom, beautiful. Right? We have this little kind of technique that we've seen throughout. Now, the king can't get close, the pawn can't promote, now we win. But there's nothing. I mean, there's just nothing. We can set little traps like check, you know, check, check. But there's nothing we can do. We can always get really close, but the king will hide behind the pawn, right? And that's it. That's the easiest thing. Unless the king is very close, which we will see later. Okay? So that's why a rook pawn is a draw, because it's a constant threat of a stalemate. With a bishop's pawn, there's also a constant threat of a stalemate, but it's in a little different of a way, right? So you're about to find out, right? So let's say we do our whole thing. Check. Right? King comes down. King doesn't go there. Check. All right, king here. Now you say, oh, $1 million square. That's what Levy taught me. Here, here. Now the king has to go here. Except it doesn't. King can go to the corner. What the hell, Levy? What? Oh, now we see. When it's a bishop's pawn, the board geometry is weird. And if we take the pawn, it's stalemate. It's just how the board works. So a bishop's pawn and a rook pawn, the king hides behind the pawn. A bishop's pawn, the king just moves to the corner and says, to hell with my pawn. Take my damn pawn, I don't care. We'll see later that there are situations with the enemy king that, for example, we can let the pawn actually become a queen and still give a mate. Or we can just force a situation with a close enough king that we don't need to worry about something like this, okay? So that's the fundamental basis. I mean, you can leave the video now, please don't, because there's still instructional stuff. But that's like queen versus pawn in a nutshell, okay? If I wanted to make a how long? 8-minute video, boom, done. But that's not the end of the story, because there's also a question of how the hell are you gonna win games if the pawn is 2 squares away from promotion, right? Like, this is winning for white. This is winning, because the pawn is 2 squares away, but how? The second this pawn gets here, it's a draw. Okay, here's the technique. The easiest thing to do, if it's a bishop's pawn and the king is close, go on the diagonal. Find a square on the diagonal. Why? Well, black has 2 moves now. Getting in front of the pawn, we know what to do, we bring the king, right? If the king goes here, you can't just make a beeline for this square, because that's not going to work, because the king just goes back. There is a move and a kind of a technique in this position, which will win you the game, okay? It wins you the game, and it's the move queen to e4. This is the perfect square to monitor black's movement. Why? Because if the pawn goes to f2, we have our little trick, and that's it. We've won the battle for the promotion square, we get there and that's it. And black doesn't have any other options. Black has to either pin himself, and then we just bring the king, or get in front of the pawn. So this is the only little trio of moves that black has here, and we just bring our king and we win the game. That would look something like king b4, king g2, king c3, king g3. Like, I'm just not pushing this pawn, right? Like this. And here, I mean, you can either go the long way, or here you have to find the move queen to g4. So there's this spot where you can force your opponent to part ways with the pawn, because they cannot go here, so they have to go here, they part ways with the pawn, And just don't stalemate them when you're trying to checkmate with a queen, for example. You know, don't do this. Please, for the love of God. That's the one thing I'm praying. Don't do that. Just cut their king off, bring the king, and then it's mate, right? So the diagonal is the way you would do this. Now, if I make this a little bit harder, right? Because that's always a little bit more fun. Let's do this, right? So the king doesn't let our queen get in the way. What do? We can still give a check, and the goal is to land on that square. So let's say here, black plays like king h1. King h1, it looks like this works, but it doesn't because of f2. And you just can't take, so that doesn't work. So what do? Check here. What's the $1 million square? Hey, remember your training. Queen e4. King g3, we have the perfect spot. Now king d5, right? So this will be the easiest thing to remember. The diagonal defense, literally any square on the diagonal, and you win the game. If the pawn is 2 squares away from promoting on a bishop square, on a bishop file, F or C, then you would bring the king. So we made it a little bit more difficult, but you know that you need to land on that square and not let the pawn get closer. Okay, we're five examples in the books. What are we, like 11 minutes into the video? Look how smart we are. You're gonna get so strong watching the videos on this channel. Openings, middle games, tactics, and now end games. Subscribe if you haven't already. We have 275,000 at the time of recording this. So now we're gonna take a look at 2 files away with a rook pawn. This one's actually a lot easier. There's no fancy schmancy stuff. Just give a check. And essentially the position that we wanna accomplish is we want the king to get in front and then play queen g4. That's the difference, is that now black has to part ways with the pawn because black is missing an entire flank to move to. So king h1 and take. Now black is not going to do that. Black will play moves like king to f2. But here it's already a win because after check, which hits both, if king g2, we have this, and it's easy win because we bring our king. And they have to part ways with the pawn. Or, let's say they go to g3, well, now we can win the battle either for the promotion square, or we can just, like, bring this. So, like, we can try to go down here right away, or we can use our geometry against our opponent. Like, the king here is a draw, but we go queen f1 and oops. So they can't push and they can't get closer with the king. And then we would bring our king. 2 pawns here, it's really not so complicated. There's one thing I did want to show in like positions like this, for example. There's also queen f5, which is a useful move, and they cannot push the pawn because we have a mate. That's the most important thing, is that we force them to push the pawn, and the one thing that's missing from their position is just one extra move to get the king out of the corner. So we use queen f5 and queen g4, and then it's kind of the same thing. So 2 squares with just 1 pawn is almost always winning. I will show you an example, like I said, the last example of this whole thing when it's not, but that hopefully helps. Now, for the next 2 examples, it's going to be the king is close. And we're going to start with the bishop's pawn. So here, let's say you screw this up, and, you know, this is the current situation. So as long as the king is 2 ranks away from a bishop's pawn, you should win. And the technique to do that is as follows. So here, if you go queen to g3, it still works, and now we see kind of the benefit is that the king is here. You just have to not take the pawn. So, for example, check, right? And then the king will come to protect. You can actually here allow the pawn to become a queen if you want to flex on your opponent. And there's a cool geometric trick, check. And they cannot block, and then you go check, and they cannot block, and then you mate. So there's this kind of like a little trick. You want to really flex on your opponent. Be careful though, because you might give them a queen and then you screw it up. So that's one way. Another way is to play like here, for example. They play here, and now you go here, which is a little bit less fancy. But the point is that again, if they queen, you have a mate in the corner of the board, and the point is they just can't check you. The queen is so close to your king, but there's nothing that it can do because anywhere it goes, it will get captured. So that's the way you would do it here. Oftentimes, you let them promote, but you have a checkmate in hand. And the same kind of applies here with a rook pawn. With a rook pawn, it's not necessarily that you need to be 2 away, because here we're actually 3 away. But this is still winning because we can give a check, for example. Now, of course, the king needs to come down. If it goes here, we have queen f1. And this is almost stalemate, actually. Black king has no legal moves, but black has this. Now the king will at least get away, and we will be able to win very easily. So if king to g1, we have a similar thing where we bring the king. Now you can actually go to h4. That's the funny thing. You really want to flex. They promote with check, and now it's their move. This is the fun part. It's their move, and they can't do anything. They have a full queen on the board, and there's nothing they can do. They can't give you a single check, but they can trick you. There's one trick. There's one trick. That's good you didn't click out earlier, because now you're going to see the trick. They have this. This is how you can trick your opponents. And if they take with the king here, they win. But if they take with the queen, it's a draw. It's stalemate. So you give this little check here at the end to test one more resolve of your opponent. And yeah, queen takes queen is a draw. So don't take with the queen. Take with the king, please. And that's that. But it's cool when the king is close because you have these little tricks. Like you let the pawn promote and then you still win the game. Now for this last one, this is a very famous example. A very famous example. It's one of the only times where being 2 ranks away is still a draw. Of course, it's white's move. If it was black's move, you push, we know this is a draw. Why? Why is this a draw? How do we defend a pawn from promoting when it's a bishop's pawn and it's 2 away? The diagonal. We need to get on the diagonal. But there's nothing we can do. And you would say, well, then, you know, we check. No, because then the pawn pushes. Oh, but what about this check? You're right. You're right. I know you thought that. I know you thought that. Don't lie to me. You thought about this check. And, you know, that check is actually very clever. Because, for example, if, like, say, king h2, well, then we get back to business. Then, for example, we can give this check, and now we get our diagonal. That's the diagonal defense. The problem is that in this position, black has a really savage move, and it's king f1. And we don't have another check. The only check that we have is going back to the corner, but that would just repeat the position. Like, now, black has to repeat. If black goes here, we're winning again, because we can go queen e5 check. And then if this, for example, we have queen b5 check. And if the king, like, moves to e1, we have a little technique here to kind of zig and zag and get back to our $1 million square, right? We have to get back to e4. That's the main thing. Like, even here, probably... Actually, if we play queen e4 now, it's a draw. So that is important. We have to not let the pawn push. So be careful how you get to e4. That's another thing. Don't just go there. You have to do it correctly. You have to do it in a way where the pawn is not actually successfully pushing. And so this is a draw. This is a draw because... Oh, sorry, not this. King to f1 is a draw because of this repetition. However, if we change even the slightest of things... and slide the king over 1 square, this is a win. And you know why it's a win? Because we defend on the diagonal. Queen to a8. You say, Levy, that's the stupidest thing I've ever seen. I know. But you also say that about me. And by the way, in this final example, we became the endgame noob. Because black has a draw. Right, we became the endgame noob, and black was the Gotham viewer. This is winning. Because if king to f2 or king to g3, what's the $1 million square? That's it. That's all I want to just show you is that is how you would win this position. If you've made it this far, you know, because some people clicked out earlier because they got bored or whatever. Since you made it this far, I will give you this piece of information just in case you are thinking about it. I was setting up a few positions. Let's just say this one. And we'll just edit this board, okay? We'll put the king like all the way on the other side. We will put the queen, put the king in the middle. Let's say like d2. We'll put 2 black pawns. And you'll say, well, Levy, what about a queen versus 2 pawns? It's really difficult in queen versus 2 pawn positions to put a rule, a specific rule. You should try, first of all, if the pawns are split, oftentimes it can be a win for the queen. Like, just an example, this is winning for the queen, although it's really difficult to figure out exactly why. But the way you would win this is you would like bring the queen like this. And if pawn push, you have check, and black has to give away one of the pawns. If this pawn goes here, you have queen d4 check. And again, we always know if the king goes here, that's what we want. But if the king has to go to the c file, we take with check. So there's these little ways to pick up one of the pawns if they're split. The problem is, if they're not split, if these pawns are not split, like this, oh, this is very bad, potentially. This could be very bad. This specific example is good for us still because the pawns are not on the second rank. If at least one of the pawns is on the second rank, it's very bad. This just doesn't work. You just can't defend against 2 pawns if your king is far away. But here this is winning because we have check. If the pawn blocks, we have check, and this is the issue. The king has to give itself away. If it goes to c2, we don't take the pawn. We don't take the pawn. But for example, we have queen to f2. And the problem is, if the pawn is hanging, the king cannot guard it, because then we take with check. The king cannot guard this way, because actually the pawns are just frozen now. Neither pawn can go, so we bring our king. And I guess last but not least, if pawn to d3, we have this. This is the $1 million square versus 2 pawns. Now, neither pawn can move forward, because of this, we have this. And you know how to win this. I know you paid attention in the earlier part of this video, right? So you know how to win this endgame. You gotta get to your $1 million square, you gotta give checks and force the king in front of the pawn. So, queen versus 2 pawns is a lot trickier. They need to be split, and if they're not split, they need to be far away, because if the closer they are to the promotion square, the harder it's going to be. And oftentimes those endgames are very easy to screw up, but the king should be closer. But hopefully this was helpful. At the time that I'm making this, I only have 2 endgame videos in my endgame series, but if you're watching this like 6 months in the future, hopefully there are more. And I have other videos on this channel as well, on openings, tactics, puzzle solving, and so on and so forth. So if you're a long-time viewer, thanks for watching. If you're watching for one of the first times, welcome, enjoy, and hope to see you around in some of my other videos.